In this video, I'm going to walk you through the top 10 baseball players that I think are next in line to be voted in through the Contemporary Era Committee of the Hall of Fame. Keep watching, and I'll tell you who's on the list. Hey everybody. Thank you for joining me on my channel, Brutus on Baseball. I'm continuing my series about the Baseball Hall of Fame with this video, which is my top 10 players that I think are most likely to get in through the Contemporary Era Voting Committee. This is an iteration of the Veterans Committee through the Hall of Fame that has undergone numerous changes over the last decade or two. Sometimes we see way too many guys being voted in. Sometimes we see almost nobody getting voted in. And because of that, the Hall of Fame sometimes decides to shake things up a bit and change up how the voting works. This past year, it happened again. They formed the Classic Era Committee, which is anybody whose career was primarily before 1980, and the Contemporary Era Committee, which is anybody whose career is primarily after 1980. You'll see in this video that there are some guys that straddle that line, and I just tried to put them in the right bucket based on where the majority of their career value came from. Now, this video will be slightly different than my other ones because these videos are my attempt at predicting who I think is most likely to actually get in, not necessarily who I think should get in or who I think was most deserving to get in. So keep that in mind as we look through the list. We're going to jump right in here with the first player on my list, Fred McGriff. McGriff peaked at about 40% of the votes in the writer's ballot in 2019, his last year on the ballot. And he really struggled there because it was such a crowded ballot with so many great players that had better careers, but had a lot of stains from the PED era. And for one reason or another, McGriff has always escaped any speculation of PEDs in the past. I think that's going to make a big difference in the upcoming Contemporary Era votes, as those writers and his peers that played with him will look at his career numbers without the stain of PEDs and give him the benefit of the doubt. My prediction is that he will get in 2023, and I put about 85% certainty on that. I'm pretty sure that he'll be the next one in this era to be voted in. His career WAA and WAR numbers are on the low side, 20 and 52. But I don't think we're at the point quite yet that the voters in the era committees pay a lot of attention to that. And because of that, I think he's going to slip in there like some of the other guys in recent years have been doing. His career accolades, 5-time All-Star, and 1-time top 5 MVP finisher, 3-time Silver Slugger, and 1 World Championship. He had 493 home runs and 2490 hits. Both of those falling just short of milestones. But a lot of people have said if the 1994 strike hadn't happened when he had one of his best years of his career, those milestones certainly would have been broken. Now, why has he missed so far? He was definitely overshadowed by other hitters from the 90s and 2000s. And he just missed those major milestones, which early on in the voting cycle mattered a lot to those voters. And you'll see that this is kind of a recurring theme in this list coming up. He played for too many teams. What does that mean exactly? It means that if you don't have a team that you identify with, a fan base that you identify with, it's harder to build the support and the narrative sometimes of why that player deserves to be in. And I think that that's the case with Fred McGriff, and why I didn't put a picture here with any hat in particular. I'm not sure which team he would go in as. Probably Atlanta Brave, but it could be one of those blank hats that doesn't represent a team too. Number 2 on the list is Curt Schilling. Well, Curt Schilling has quite a sordid history with the Hall of Fame voting. And I don't want to get to all of it here, but let's just say that he's had a lot of ups and downs. He peaked at 71% in 2021, which is actually his 9th year on the ballot, and then he fell like 10% in 2022. My prediction, he likely will get in 2023, because I don't think he'll have all that stigma of baseball writers that don't like him and don't like the things that he's said, choosing not to vote for him. He's going to have a small group of journalists and a small group of his peers that are likely to just look at his career and his numbers and his impact on the game of baseball, which, if you look at only those things, I think he is a surefire Hall of Famer. I put with certainty about 75%, so not quite as certain as Fred McGriff for that year. His WAA and WAR numbers, 54 and 80, are way better than a guy like McGriff and really show that there should not be a question about whether he's a Hall of Fame caliber pitcher. For what it's worth, he has 200 plus wins, 3,000 plus strikeouts. He's a 6-time All-Star, 4-time top 5 in the Cy Young Award voting, including 3 times that he placed second place. He was also a 3-time World Series champion and a big game pitcher, which we'll never forget from those Diamondback days, and especially winning the 2004 World Series with the Red Sox. Why did he miss? At the time, he had a marginal win total, which isn't as important these days as it was even 5 or 10 years ago. But most importantly, his personality and his extreme political stance, as well as the encouragement of violence, first about lynching journalists, and second, his support and comments about the January 6th insurrection. These things did not help his case whatsoever. We'll see how he's treated by the Era Committee coming up, and if they can ignore his abrasive personality or not. Number 3 on my list is Jeff Kent. I put him on this list for the Contemporary Committee, even though he's actually still on the writer's ballot. But that's because he's coming up on his 10th year on the ballot, and he's not going to make it. His peak was around 32% just this last year. My prediction is that he'll likely get in when he's first eligible in 2026, and I put that certainty around 70%. His career WAA and WAR numbers, 26 and 55, are good, but not great, but his accolades mean something. He was a 5-time All-Star, 1-time MVP, 4-time Silver Slugger, and the most home runs by a second baseman in the history of the game of baseball. And that's what I think will become important when he's first voted on in a committee. Why does he miss so far? He missed milestones, and he was not a favorite of journalists who have been voting for him for the last 9 years. And he had quite poor defense, minus 52 defensive runs saved, which severely did impact his overall WA and WAR numbers. I think he's a guy that needs to get in very quickly by his peers, because if he doesn't make it in and it waits too long, our understanding of the game will continue to evolve, and his candidacy will look worse as time goes by. Number 4 on my list is actually 4A and 4B. Same story for 2 different players, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. They both peaked at around 65% in 2022, which was their final year on the writer's ballot. I'm guessing that they'll get in 2029, and I pegged that certainty around 65% or so. So we're almost getting into the territory of just flipping a coin. I imagine the first time that they come up for eligibility in the committee, there may be a lot of questions about whether they should be getting in, but they're getting more and more support, not only from writers that flip their votes over time as the years went by, but also their peers, guys that have been in the Hall of Fame and have been getting into the Hall of Fame, that know that these 2 players were the best at their positions in their generation. We've seen some current Hall of Famers, Mike Schmidt, for example, speak about PED use and maybe giving us a better perspective of how these substances may have even been used during his playing career. And then we've had some guys being voted in the last decade that have questionable past in terms of PED use. A lot of smoke maybe, but no fire. And if the constituency of the Hall of Fame continues to change, maybe Clemens and Bonds will be seen by their peers as a glaring omission to the Hall of Fame if they're the only ones that aren't there. From their WAA and WAR numbers, I don't need to recite, you can see here how amazing they were as baseball players. A lot of home runs, a lot of wins, a lot of strikeouts, a lot of MVP and Cy Young awards, and the only reason they're not there is because of PEDs and the fact that they were quite disliked. We'll see if that changes over time, but in my guess, they may miss 1 or 2 cycles, but eventually things will change and they will get in. Now, moving on from controversy, get to number 5 on the list, which is Dwight Evans. Evans is one of those guys that has been generating more support as time goes on because his game was undervalued at the time he played. But as we understand analytics more, we see that he's more valuable than we thought. He had 8 out of 12 votes in the 2022 Era Committee voting. And my prediction is that he might actually get in 2029. I give him about a 50% chance of that. His WA and WAR numbers for his career are 33 and 67. Quite good, but maybe borderline for a Hall of Famer. He was a 3-time All-Star. 2 times he finished top 5 in the MVP voting. 8-time Gold Glove winner. 2-time Silver Slugger. 1-time World Series champion. And he was just shy of the 2,500 hits and 400 home runs. He was known to have very solid defense and a great throwing arm. And one of the key accolades, in my opinion, a lot of people are starting to see now that he was actually a much better player than Jim Rice, who was an outfielder on the same team as Evans for a long time on the Red Sox and got into the Hall of Fame several years ago now. Why did Evans miss? He missed those traditional milestones, the 2,500 hits, 400 home runs, and recent metrics have shown that he was much better than he was seen at the time. So he wasn't valued as much during previous voting cycles, but now we're starting to understand him better. Number 6 on my list is Sweet Lou Whitaker. Whitaker was not really seen as a great ball player during his career. He was very solid, very consistent for a very long period of time. Alan Trammell was his double play partner, playing shortstop for the Tigers, and he was seen as more the superstar, whereas Whitaker was a supporter. But as time went by and we look at analytics and reevaluate players' careers, it looks like Whitaker was much better than we gave him credit for. He has not had very good showing in previous voting cycles. 2.9% in his 1 time on the writer's ballot in 2001. But in 2022, he was put on the Era Committee and he got 6 out of 12 votes. A lot of people who are in the know about how good Whitaker was thought that this was a very disappointing result. But to me, this was actually a big win. It was his first time that he was ever given a good chance at the Hall of Fame, and he got half the votes that he needed to. I think he will get in. I'm going to put it around 50% likelihood. His WAA and WAR, 43 and 75, show how great of a player he really was and how misunderstood his game was at the time. His accolades: he was a 5-time All-Star, Rookie of the Year 1978, 3-time Gold Glove winner, 4-time Silver Slugger, and a 1-time World Series champion for those 1984 Tigers. Why didn't he get much support for the Hall of Fame? Well, he missed those major milestones that are sexy numbers, and metrics have been recently developed that show how great he really was. He was a very steady contributor over a long period of time. My hope is that over time, Whitaker's case only improves so that maybe we can move him up on this list or even get him into the Hall of Fame to join his career-long double play partner. Number 7 on the list is Kenny Lofton. Lofton is another guy that was one and done on the writer's ballot, only getting 3% of the vote in 2013. The biggest reason why is because that ballot was overcrowded with guys to vote for. A lot of people wouldn't vote for the suspected PED users, but a lot of people did. So those votes were so spread out that a lot of great players dropped off way too soon over that decade. My prediction is that he will eventually get in. I put his percent certainty as maybe around 40%. His WAA of 38 and his WAR of 68 show that he was a great player. He was a 6-time All-Star, 1-time top 5 MVP finisher, 4-time Gold Glover. He had solid defense, 622 stolen bases, and almost 2,500 hits. Why didn't he get a lot of support? Well, he missed the milestones, and he was way overshadowed by Ricky Henderson and Tim Raines, who were finishing their career around the time that Lofton was starting his. And he's another example of way too many teams. He played for 11 over his career, and a lot of people start to wonder why you can't stick with a team if you're traded around that much. The bottom line is that Lofton was a great player, and maybe we need to give him a bit of a longer look than just one and done in 2013. Number 8 on the list is another one of those one and done players, Kevin Brown, who got 2% of the vote in 2011. My prediction is way too far in the future to even think about it seriously at this point. But I put the percent certainty that he'll get in someday through an era committee at around 25%. His WAA of 40 and his WAR of 60 show that he was a great player, especially his WAA of 40, along with Lou Whitaker and Curt Schilling, showing how much better they were than the average player during their career. He was a 6-time All-Star, 2-time Cy Young top 5 finisher, and a 1-time World Series champion with the Florida Marlins. He had 211 career wins, which seemed low in 2011 maybe, but now a decade later, maybe is not as big of a deal if he was really that dominant. Why did he miss? Low win and low strikeout totals. Too many teams, 6, not as much as Lofton, but same story as McGriff. Definitely the overcrowded ballot hurt him, and he just wasn't very well liked either, which is kind of a consistent thing that we're seeing on the guys that fell off the writer's ballot and have to be looked at by the era committees. Number 9 on the list is Johan Santana. Johan was another one and done in 2018 when he got 2.4% of the vote. Like Kevin Brown, his candidacy takes him way too far in the future, maybe a 20% certainty that he'll make it someday. But he's got a different story than Kevin Brown. His WAA of 33 and his WAR of 51 are low, and there's a good reason why. His career was ended quite short. But what a career that he had when he was pitching. His peak is one of the highest that we've seen, very similar to a guy like Sandy Koufax. He was a 4-time All-Star. He won 2 Cy Young Awards and placed in the top 5 3 more times. He was a 1-time Gold Glove winner. He had a very high peak from 2002 to 2008, and he threw the only no-hitter in Mets history. But why didn't he get in? He has those very low career totals for the Hall of Fame. Not enough wins, not enough strikeouts. He had the overcrowded ballot, and he would need to be seen for his out-of-this-world peak from those years in the 2000s, rather than the longevity of his career. And there's not a whole lot of guys that have been given that treatment outside of Sandy Koufax. But if we compare their careers side by side, there are a lot of similarities to be seen there. And the last guy on my list is Dale Murphy. Murphy got some support for a long period of time, topping out at 23% in the year 2000. I think he's way in the future as well. Peg him around maybe 15% certainty that he will be elected someday. And here's why that's so low. He was another peak guy. A very high peak where he won 2 MVPs in a short period of time, but he didn't last very long. His career basically fell off after the age of 32 or so. His WAA of 16 and his WAR of 46 are both too low for most Hall of Famers. He was a 7-time All-Star, like I said, 2-time MVP in the early 80s for the Braves, 5 Gold Gloves, 4 Silver Sluggers, and the key here, he was one of the most well-liked players, just a fantastic human being. And so the journalists love him, but it wasn't enough to get him enough votes. His career just wasn't long enough. I put him number 10 on this list over some of the other guys that I could have, just because I'm curious about that likability factor of his. If he gets the right people on an era committee that speak about what a contributor he was for the Braves in the early 80s, maybe they'll be able to sway enough voters to vote for him. And for that reason, he's kind of a wild card there. So we'll just have to see how that all plays out. Like my other list, my honorable mentions. These guys are guys that are not on the radar, I don't think at least. But maybe these guys are just as good as some of the guys in that top 10 list that I just presented. And I really would like to get their stories out there so we continue talking and thinking about them, especially for the guys that were one and done on the writers' ballots. The first on this list is one of my favorite players, I will admit, when I was a kid growing up. And that's Jim Edmonds. In his one time on the writer's ballot, he got 2.5% in 2016. I don't think he's very certain to get in, but his WAA and WAR numbers are 35 and 60, showing that he has a really borderline Hall of Fame argument going on. His accolades, 4-time All-Star, 2 times that he finished top 5 in the MVP voting, 8-time Gold Glove winner, and if you grew up with Edmonds, you know that he was a human highlight reel on ESPN every night. He was also a Silver Slugger winner. He won a World Series championship with the St. Louis Cardinals and a 132 OPS plus to go along with that great defense in center field. Why is he not really considered much for the Hall of Fame? Well, he missed those milestones. He's got less than 200 hits and less than 400 home runs, which doesn't help. And a lot of the reason for that was injuries that he suffered in his career. So he just couldn't stay on the field. But despite that, his overall game and his numbers, I think, warrant a better conversation. Next up, Mark McGuire. I put him down here because he's got a similar story to Bonds and Clemens, just not as great of a player. But I put him on this honorable mention list because I think his chances of getting in just aren't as high. He topped out at about 23% in 2010 and eventually fell off the ballot. I put him at about 10% certainty as well that he'll get in someday. His WAA and WAR numbers 37 and 62 are again borderline Hall of Fame, but his accolades, he was a great player at his time and he was seen as such. 12-time All-Star, Rookie of the Year 1987 when he hit 49 home runs to break the rookie record at the time. 3 times he finished in the top 5 of the MVP voting. A Gold Glove, 3-time Silver Slugger, a World Series championship with the Oakland Athletics in 1989, 583 home runs, and a 163 OPS plus, which is just phenomenal as a hitter. Why did he miss? It's because he broke Roger Maris's record and then later on admitted to doing it while taking PEDs. And people said he couldn't have done it without the help of PEDs. Looking back on that era, lots of people see the juiced era totally differently. And I'm one of those that sees it as something that was so ingrained in the culture of baseball. And PEDs were used so widely across the board that it's hard to pick and choose here our battles of who we think deserves what and who doesn't. Especially in some cases when we know people failed to test or admitted to taking something, and then others that we just don't have a clue. So it's hard to separate fact from fiction here. My bottom line, I think McGuire took PEDs to try to stay on the field more often. He dealt with a lot of injuries. If we were to ignore the PEDs, I think he's an easy Hall of Famer. But the argument is if we don't ignore the PEDs, maybe he wouldn't have stayed on the field or had the numbers to be a Hall of Famer. It's a difficult argument, I know, and it's going to be one that era committees continue to struggle with for a long time. Next on my list is Will the Thrill Clark, a smooth swinger from the late 80s and early 90s San Francisco Giants. He topped out at 4.4% in 2006 on the writer's ballot. I put him at about 5% certainty. I think he's going to have a tough hill to climb to get to the Hall of Fame. His WAA of 29 and 56 are on the low side, especially for the Hall of Fame, but there's a reason why, and we'll discuss that in a minute. He was a 6-time All-Star, 4 times he placed in the top 5 of the MVP voting. He was a Gold Glove winner, 2-time Silver Slugger winner, and his slash line and his OPS plus were both exceptional. Why did he miss? Well, he missed those milestones. Why did he miss those milestones? He retired early at 36 years old when he was still at the top of his game. In his last year, he had a 145 OPS plus, and that really says something about how good of a hitter he was. If he had played a couple more years, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation, but he didn't, and so we have to deal with the stats that we have. I loved him as a kid, so I'm probably biased, but I would like to see him with a lot more Hall of Fame support. Last guy on my list, and the last guy I want to talk about, is Rafael Palmeiro. For those of you that maybe were too young at the time, This picture here is him wagging his finger at Congress when testifying about not ever using PEDs in the game of baseball. And then not long after that, he was suspended for a failed PED test. He did get up to 12% of the writers' votes in 2012, but he fell off pretty quickly thereafter. I peg his chances around 5%, not very good. And it's really his story, his narrative of testifying in Congress and being adamant that he's never used PEDs and then turning around and being one of the first to be suspended. His WAA of 30 shows that he was a good player, not exceptionally great compared to his peers, but consistently really good. But his 72 WAR shows that he did it for a long period of time. His accolades, he got over that 3,000 hit mark, which is huge, and over the 500 home run mark. That should have been an easy in for him. But as we know, it wasn't. He's a 4-time All-Star, 1-time MVP top 5 guy, so not a great MVP finisher. He was a 3-time Gold Glove winner, and this is the first time I brought it up, but Gold Gloves weren't always the best standard to compare defensive value against. But if you're curious about why I'm talking about it here with Palmeiro, go look up the 1999 awards for Gold Glove, and if you dig a little bit, you'll see why he never should have won this award. Why did he miss? That wagging finger and the PED suspension, especially combined. Should he be in the Hall of Fame based on numbers? Absolutely. Can we believe those numbers and do we know what's real? No, not at all. And that's why it's so hard to judge the juiced era. Because if it wasn't for that PED suspension at the very end of his career, he probably would have waltzed right into the Hall of Fame without any of us knowing. And there could very well be guys that are already in the Hall of Fame with almost the exact same story, but just not the suspension, which is exactly why I feel the way I do about that era. There's so much we don't know, so it's hard to be judge, jury, and executioner for these players all at the same time. So that's it for my top baseball players most likely to get in through the Contemporary Era Committee of the Hall of Fame. I hope you enjoyed seeing my list. Let me know in the comments down below if you agreed, disagreed, and who you think I missed out on. I've got tons of other information about baseball, baseball history, other players on a Hall of Fame career path. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to having more and more of these conversations. Until next time, keep talking baseball and take care.